In 1720, a convicted murderer controlled the entire money supply of France. He had escaped from an English prison. He had killed a man in a duel. And somehow, he convinced the most powerful court in Europe to let him print unlimited paper money. For a few short years, it worked. France experienced an economic boom unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Then it all came apart, taking the French economy, the monarchy's credibility, and the man's entire fortune down with it. This is the story of John Law, and the first time in history a government tried to solve a war debt crisis by simply printing its way out. To understand this story, we need to start with a king who spent like there was no tomorrow. Louis XIV ruled France for 72 years. He fought war after war across Europe, campaigns that required enormous armies, enormous fleets, and enormous amounts of money. To pay for it all, the French crown borrowed. Constantly. By the time Louis XIV died in 1715, France's national debt had reached a staggering level, roughly equal to the entire annual output of the French economy. For decades, the crown had also repeatedly debased its own coinage, reducing the silver content of coins to squeeze out extra value. The public's trust in French money was already fragile. When Louis XIV died, his successor, Louis XV, was a 5-year-old child. Real power fell to a regent, the Duke of Orleans, who inherited a kingdom on the edge of bankruptcy. The Duke needed a solution. And into his court walked a foreigner with a radical idea. John Law was born in Edinburgh, the son of a goldsmith and banker. He was brilliant with numbers, and he was also, by his own admission, a gambler. In 1694, Law killed a man in a duel in London. He was sentenced to death, but escaped from prison and fled to the continent. For years, Law wandered Europe, gambling in card rooms from Amsterdam to Venice, and along the way, studying how the most advanced banks and financial markets in the world actually worked. He developed a theory. A country's wealth wasn't limited by how much gold and silver it had. A well-managed paper currency, backed by trust and economic activity, could create far more prosperity. In 1716, the Duke of Orleans gave Law permission to test this theory. Law founded the Banque Générale, a private bank authorized to issue paper banknotes. These notes could be exchanged for coin on demand, and crucially, they were accepted for paying taxes. Almost immediately, the notes began circulating widely. Trade picked up. The economy, starved of stable currency for years, responded with relief. Encouraged, Law expanded his ambitions. In 1717, he acquired a company holding the trade monopoly over France's vast territory in North America, the Mississippi Valley, including Louisiana. He called it the Compagnie d'Occident, the Company of the West. On paper, it controlled an entire continent's worth of trade, furs, tobacco, and according to the rumors Law actively encouraged, gold and silver mines of fabulous wealth. The reality of Louisiana, a swampy, sparsely populated colony, looked nothing like the picture Law was painting. But the public didn't know that, and the public wanted in. Shares of the company went on sale. And then Law did something extraordinary. He merged the company with the Banque Générale, and then with the system that managed France's entire national debt. By 1719, Law's company had absorbed the tax collection system, the colonial trade monopolies, and the management of the royal mint. One organization now controlled almost the entirety of French public finance. Investors didn't just buy shares, they fought to buy them. The narrow street outside Law's offices, the Rue Quincampoix, became so crowded with speculators that the crush of people reportedly caused injuries and deaths. Share prices that had started around 500 livres rose to over 10,000. In less than a year, the value had increased nearly 20 times over. Ordinary people became millionaires overnight. A new word entered the French language for these instant fortunes. Millionaire itself is believed to have originated from this very period. But to fuel this frenzy, law needed more and more paper money in circulation. So the bank, now effectively the central bank of France, kept printing. The amount of paper currency in circulation expanded dramatically, far beyond what the gold and silver reserves of the bank could ever cover. In January 1720, Law reached the absolute peak of his power. He was appointed Controller General of Finance, effectively, the most powerful financial official in France. A foreign-born former fugitive now controlled the French state's money, debt, and trade. But cracks were already forming. Some of the shrewdest investors, including a few well-connected nobles, quietly began converting their paper profits back into gold and silver and moving that wealth out of France. Law saw the danger. In early 1720, the government issued increasingly desperate decrees, restricting how much gold and silver any individual could hold, and eventually banning the use of coin for many transactions altogether. It backfired completely. The harder the government tried to force people to trust paper money, the more obvious it became that the system was in trouble. People rushed to convert notes to coin before it became impossible. A bank run began. Crowds gathered outside the bank, demanding gold and silver in exchange for their notes. The bank's reserves were nowhere near sufficient. Share prices, which had risen nearly 20-fold, began to collapse. By September 1720, they had fallen to a fraction of their peak. By the following year, they were back near where they had started, wiping out almost the entire boom. For thousands of investors, the paper fortunes they had celebrated just months earlier evaporated completely. The value of the paper currency itself collapsed too. Prices for goods swung wildly as confidence in French money evaporated. In May 1720, Law was dismissed from his position. By December, fearing for his life, he fled France reportedly in disguise, leaving behind the very fortune his system had created. He spent his remaining years in exile, moving between European cities, gambling to survive. He died in Venice in 1729, poor and largely shunned. The French government spent the next year trying to clean up the wreckage. Investors who couldn't prove they had paid for their shares with real assets rather than borrowed credit had their holdings confiscated. Taxes were raised sharply. The government partially defaulted on debts. The economic depression that followed lasted years, but the deepest damage wasn't economic, it was psychological. For generations afterward, the French public associated paper money, and banks themselves, with fraud and ruin. France would not establish a true central bank again for nearly a century. While other European nations developed sophisticated banking systems, France remained deeply suspicious of paper currency and credit. Compare this to Britain, which experienced its own bubble that same year, the South Sea Bubble. Britain recovered, and the Bank of England went on to become the foundation of the modern financial world. France, scarred by Law's collapse, fell behind. Its government continued accumulating debt the old-fashioned way, through borrowing it couldn't easily manage for the rest of the century. By the 1780s, France's monarchy was once again drowning in debt. Debt it had no modern financial tools left to manage, because the trauma of 1720 had closed off so many of those tools. Historians continue to debate how directly connected these events are. But there is a real argument that the financial trauma of 1720 helped shape the institutional weakness that contributed to the fiscal crisis preceding the French Revolution in 1789. And in a strange historical echo, when the revolutionary government needed money decades later, it turned again to paper currency, the assignats, which collapsed in almost exactly the same way. Today, law's basic idea that a government can manage its economy through controlled paper money creation is the foundation of how every modern central bank operates. And the pattern law created, merging speculative investment with a nation's money supply and debt, has reappeared again and again. Dot-com stocks, housing markets, cryptocurrency. The names change, the technology changes. But the underlying mechanism, easy money, soaring asset prices, public euphoria, and a collapse that arrives faster than anyone expects, has never really gone away. Some economists argue law's underlying ideas weren't entirely wrong, that with better execution and more patience, a version of his system might have worked. We'll likely never know. What we do know is what happened when it was tried for real, in a kingdom already drowning in war debt, run by a regent desperate for any solution, and executed by a man whose entire life had been a bet. For a few months in 1719, it must have felt like magic. Free money, endless growth, a debt crisis solved with the stroke of a pen. History rarely punishes the mistake immediately. It waits until everyone has stopped worrying about it. If you made it this far, leave a comment. Do you see any modern situations that remind you of John Law's system? What do you think happens next time? History is full of moments like this, quiet decisions that, decades later, change everything. If this story stayed with you, that's exactly why we tell it.